John Curran's going to be our first speaker. He has a few things to say. And it turns out that I used to work for John at a place that you probably have never heard of called BBN Planet, that no longer exists and became something else, I think. Anyway, he's the president and CEO of ARIN, and for those of you who don't know what ARIN is, it's ARIN.net, and you can look. It's the American Registry for Internet Numbers. And he's going to talk about some address depletion because, we're running out. So here we go.
Thank you, Kathy. I hope everyone knows what ARIN is. I kind of made the slides presuming you all know what ARIN is and what we do, but I'll give you the 10-second. We're one of the 5 regional internet registries, so the ones that serve North America, being U.S., Canada, and parts of the Caribbean. ARIN was formed at the end of 1987. The end of 1997. Thank you. We actually took the registry functions that were being done under contract by Network Solutions at the time and decided that much like in the RIPE region and in the APNIC region, there should be a regional internet registry that's member-led and does community-based policies. So we formed ARIN. ARIN was actually the registry of the rest of the world, because we had APNIC and RIPE, and ARIN originally was North America, South America, parts of Africa. Over time, we thought that it would be best that there would be regional registries that serve the needs of each community, and we found communities in Latin America that wanted to form an RIR. We helped support that, and the same thing with AFRINIC, with the formation of AFRINIC. So now there's 5 regional internet registries. What I'm going to talk about today is how ARIN is going to handle IPv4 address requests post-exhaustion view. This is once the IANA free pool has been fully depleted, and folks are certainly around to talk about that, how ARIN will handle requests that are coming in. This is relevant because some of you work for companies who put requests into ARIN to get address space, and you know how it's worked for 10, 20 years, and now you need to know how it's going to work going forward, because it's a little different, okay? So let me start right in. Post-exhaustion, there's some soft landing provisions in the ARIN NRPM. The NRPM is the Network Resource Policy Manual. It's a set of policies adopted by the community on how we do address allocation and assignments. So there's a policy that says once you're known to ARIN, you've been a member for more than a year, you can request up to 12 months worth of addresses, and that's what most of you do. Once the final /8 has been received by ARIN, we only allow processing of requests that are up to 90 days, 3 months supply. So it's not that you can't get addresses, it's just you need to come back and get them in smaller cups. Your bucket is smaller, we'll see you more often. And this way, we don't have a circumstance where parties get a year's worth and then someone else gets none. Everyone gets 3 months, and then everyone comes back and gets 3 months, and then everyone comes back and gets 3 months, and then we'll see what happens after that next 3 months. So this is the first thing you need to realize. You're going to be putting in more requests because it creates an even run-out provision. Doesn't apply to transfers under specified transfers. I'll talk a little bit about that. So the other policy, specified transfer policy, NRPM 8.3, approved and implemented, provides incentive for a party that may be able to free up IP address blocks, like by renumbering, getting themselves in the lower half of the block and freeing the higher one, for example, can transfer to another party that meets the requirements for address space. So if you qualify for address space and you need address space, and you come to ARIN and you want your assignment, and we say you qualify but we have none, you can in turn bring another party, just grab them by the ear, drag them over to ARIN, and say they're going to give me addresses, and we'll update the records accordingly. Now, it's quite possible that you're going to incent each other somehow for that. I don't know. I don't want to know, actually. I have no interest in knowing. So it's possible that there'll be remuneration going around there. That's perfectly fine. All we need to know is we're transferring addresses. This also means you can only get address space that you can actually qualify for, and it's up to a year's worth of address space based on your run rate of demand. So this is a great way if you might be a little out of position for IPv6, that new internet protocol, and you need a little more time. This is also a way to address it even when ARIN doesn't have resources. This is the only transfer policy that's recognized. So there's a merger transfer policy. I'll talk about that. There's this transfer policy. But there are no other ways to move addresses around that Aaron recognizes. So let's talk about the M&A. The policy that was adopted in the Network Resource Policy Manual recently says unused address space must be returned to Aaron during an M&A transfer. So if you acquire an organization and it has a substantial amount of address space and it has a less substantial network infrastructure, the address space that gets transferred is what's needed for the network infrastructure. It is not the entire block. Surprise, surprise. You want the rest of the block? Specified transfer policy. We already talked about that. Have a nice day. Sorry, all good news this morning. Two policies that might affect this that the community is currently discussing and that will be discussed in our currently under discussion on PPML, the public policy mailing list at the Aaron website, and also under discussion at the upcoming public policy meeting, is a globally coordinated transfer policy, PP 119, Policy Proposal 119, which will allow transfers of IP addresses to the resource registrant of another RIR as long as the two RIRs agree and exercise stewardship and values expressed in 2050. So to the extent that another RIR has a matching policy or complementary policy and Aaron has a policy and you want to transfer not between two parties in the Aaron region but to another region, that should be possible. But this is still under discussion. It may not pass, it may pass. To the extent that you think this is important, you should probably, rather than waiting to see what happens, you should probably voice support or opposition to it, and you can do that online. You do not need to be an Aaron member. You do not need to go to a meeting. Just get on the mailing list and start talking about these proposals. Another one is protecting number resources, which right now, Aaron, when we see something that looks like fraud, we actually do act against that, and we do occasionally reclaim address blocks that people transfer contrary to, or try to transfer contrary to policy. This one says to proactively look for fraud. That's a little different. That means actively looking out there for people doing transfers. That's looking at routing tables and corporation bankruptcies, and I can think of a whole bunch of other ways of doing it. Costs money to do that. Costs people, costs time. That's membership money. Will we do this or not? Again, that's your input. If you want Aaron to do this, we'll do that. If you don't want us to do it, we won't do it, but you need to put your input on the mailing lists or come to the San Juan meeting, or even better, both. So that's kind of where we are looking at what happens to IPv4 requests after depletion. The policies that I highlighted are the soft landing provisions, which our policy will kick in very soon, the specified transfer policy, which is in effect as well, and then these policy proposals will have impact on how address requests are handled if they're adopted. They haven't been adopted, they're just in discussion. So the way Aaron's incorporated, we have some things in our Articles of Incorporation, Charter, and Mission that cause us to pay attention to stewardship, conservation, aggregation, and registration of number resources. We pay attention to this, and we're not a passive entity in protecting these values. So to the extent that someone is using resources contrary to policy, we reclaim resources. Nowadays, that's wonderful, because we reclaim resources, and it seems that there's a great pool of people who want more numbers, so we'll very quickly be able to get them back out to the community. But just letting people understand, we don't really have a choice. We're obligated by the direction of the community to do this. We have policies and proposals post-depletion which don't end IPv4, but provide a reasonable set of policies that will let people who have need get at address space and encourage the return of address space and its reuse, potentially even to other regions who continue to subscribe to the stewardship principles. So we think we've got a pretty good balance based on the policies we have and the ones in discussion, but ultimately it's going to be up to you guys as to how you want the IPv4 address space to be managed. That's all I have. Information page, www.aaron.net, knowledge, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
So while I'm making these slides appear, I'm supposed to make you fill out the survey. So you should fill out the survey, because I hear there's prizes. I'm going to make it not really good with PCs. So Elise, So do you remember when you were a kid you thought, oh, I'll remember every book I ever read because you'd only read like 5 of them, and then before you knew it, you read a bunch of books and you didn't remember that you read the book until you tried to read it again? And then as an adult you figured, oh, I'll remember every place I ever worked and everybody I ever worked for example. And then you wake up one morning at Nanog 51 and you realize that not only did you work with Elise a really long time ago on the NSFNet, but you actually worked for her and completely had forgotten about it. That was my morning. Anyway, Elise is in charge of the IANA, and she's going to give us some insight on IPv4 depletion.
I actually didn't know Kathy worked for me. That's news. No, I know. I have to tell the story. So Kathy did work for me at Home Networks, and she worked all these hours, all the time. Like Kathy, you know Kathy. She's always working, and she gives up 150% to everything. So she came to me and said, you know, I just want to take this one day off, but Paul told me I have to put in a vacation day form. And I've worked all these hours. Can't I just have some comp time? I said, Kathy, just take it. You don't have to ask for a Paul pass from Paul. Do you remember that? Yeah, I do. So Kathy just worked all those hours, and she didn't have to file for vacation because, you know, heck, she was there all the time. So that's our little history. But my title is IPv6 is spreading from the center, and you're probably saying, so what does that mean? Good question. I wanted to know too. So basically, what I wanted to talk about today is that if you don't have the infrastructure to support IPv6, things are just going to break. And most people who use the network don't care about the infrastructure. And what we just heard from John is all about the policies of some of the parts of the infrastructure, the addresses. And the speaker after me is going to talk about the commercial part of the addresses. And this is NANOG, Network Operators Group. So what I wanted to talk about was operating some of the parts of the network, the center of the network and the infrastructure. And I do assume that we do have some operators here. So if not, this probably will bore you and it'll go very fast anyway. But at ICANN and IANA, one of the things we're interested in, other than just numbers, is the domain name system. And the domain name system has components that are dependent on IPv6 also, because after all, if you send a domain name and all it does is resolve to an IPv4 address, and there are services or end systems or something else out there that, oh my gosh, couldn't get an IPv4 address, and they only have an IPv6 address, or they only have connectivity over IPv6, what the heck is the domain name system going to do? So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. It's only about 4 slides. So the domain name system has this stuff called IPv6 glue. It has glue for IPv4 too, but I'm not talking about IPv4 today. And it took me a while to get my head around IPv6 glue and IPv4 glue. And so I thought of a joke. Kathy will remember it. Maybe Bill Norton will remember it. He probably even told it at a NANOG. So, the joke is, why does the engineer run out of shampoo? And it's because he followed the directions. It's wash, rinse, repeat. So I thought, that's really what glue's all about. It's this loop. If you don't have the glue, you have this resolving loop, and you can never get your name resolved. So nobody laughed, so that probably was a Bill Norton joke. But anyway. So Japan and JP and KT were the first TLDs that actually were aggressive in this area. And so, they put IPv6 glue in the root zone way back in 2004. And that was pretty optimistic. They really believed that there would be a transition a lot faster and people would start adopting and enabling their infrastructure. Well, now there are 292 glue records. Actually, there are 296. This slide was made like around the 1st of January, and as of the 31st, there's 296 in the root zone. So people have gotten the idea. Finally, it's, becoming a little more clear to the infrastructure people and the operators that, there are IPv6 stuff out there, and so we need to put this glue in place. Well, one way of measuring how successful that is or isn't is not by saying, okay, do the name servers have glue? Another way is saying, okay, are they accessible via IPv6? And this map kind of indicates which parts of the world have accessibility via and diversity of IPv6 to name servers. So it doesn't have a color code on it, I noticed. The reds are the bad ones. They have zero diversity or IPv6 connectivity for their name servers. And then it goes orange, has better. That means they maybe have, some. Yellow, it gets a little better yet. And, it's red, orange, yellow, and then green. So you might think that, okay, what is green? That must be really, really good. So green means that, you have diversity and access by 3 or 4 different means, not much more than that. So we go from 0 to 4 if it's good for diversity. And that's kind of the way the map looks today. And, of course, you need the root DNS servers to have this glue in it. It's a hierarchy. You're all operators, DNS is a hierarchy. And so you've got to have it in the root, or you should have it in the root. Then you've got the TLDs, which I talked about earlier. And then anybody else that runs name servers should also be aware of having IPv6 glue. So right now, there are 9 root DNS servers that have IPv6 glue since January. And that's good. It's not bad, it's good. And all of this I'm getting from the URL that's up there, the rootservers.org. And this is a map of DNS that's served over IPv6. And what I mean by that is not only is there IPv6 enabled, but there's IPv6 connectivity. If you don't have the transport or the peering between your DNS name server and something else that talks IPv6, it really doesn't matter. You're kind of like talking to yourself. Nobody cares. But these root servers can resolve the IPv6 addresses with peers. And for more detail, you'd have to go to that site because these little bubbles are kind of small. But this is sort of just a promo for those of you that operate networks and name servers, that if you haven't considered implementing, IPv6 glue in your name server, you should. And I want to thank you very much, and it's nice to be here again.
Where did the little thing go? Okay. Did I mention that I don't like PCs? Golding. My Mac is just really happy. And how do you make this full screen? Slideshow. Slideshow. F5. Where's F5?
No, bad job.
No, that's not it. Celebrity, security.
Is it okay? Yeah.
There. Okay. So I have to introduce you.
Really?
Yeah, I totally do. So when I met Dan, he was at an Aaron meeting, and he stood up 6 years ago.
It was something like that, yeah.
And he said that there should be an open market for IP addresses. And that caused quite a stir in our peaceful little Aaron community. And there was much arguing that ensued that day. Anyway, Dan is a managing director at DH Capital, and before that he was a VP of research at Tier 1 Research, and he supervised all sorts of colo research and managed hosting stuff. So he's the the counterpoint to the first two presentations, and I'm looking forward to it.
I still remember that date, Aaron, as if it were yesterday. I'm the evil capitalist. How's everyone doing this morning? Hey, everybody's tired. Great. Come on. Good morning. Yeah. Yeah. So, good morning, everyone. Yikes. I think someone's broken. Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to do a brief commercial. Please join NANOG. NANOG's a membership organization now. Huge number of people joined yesterday and the day before. It would be great if we broke 100 members today, so please join. So that being said, my name's Dan Golding. I'm the designated capitalist on this panel, although that's unfair to John. John is a heck of a capitalist, now, although he's gone over to the dark side now as a regulator. What I'm here to talk about today is not actually market-based allocation of IPv4 space, which is a favorite topic of mine, but instead the perspective from a lot of operators about what happens with IPv4 exhaustion. We hear a lot at NANOG from carriers, and for many years NANOG was a very strongly carrier-centric event. I think in recent years there's been a real shift to content providers and looking out over the audience, an increasingly large number of hosting providers. And these are folks whom have a tremendous number of IP address resources, have a tremendous number of servers into the millions, control lots of endpoints, and control lots of content. The content that does not sit with the major content providers, be they CDNs like Akamai, be they folks like Google, tends to sit with the hosting gods. Now, for those of you who are from 1998, hosting is no longer small potatoes web hosting. There was a time when shared hosting and you could have 5,000 websites in a single IP address, that this was the most common methodology. Things have shifted a lot. We're now in a situation where we have a $30 billion annual business with managed hosting, dedicated hosting, cloud, whatever cloud means, all that great stuff. So what's hosted primarily? A lot of things are hosted. In addition to the sort of standard websites, you see a lot of small, medium business and enterprise applications, things like email, a lot of databases, HR, accounting. Most enterprise production systems for enterprises and SMBs that know what they're doing are in a hosted model. And things are increasingly moving towards that. The hosting business is growing probably 20% year over year, including during the recession, and it's actually profitable. So hosting providers, and these go from hosting providers who have $1 billion in revenue down to the guys who have $10 million in revenue. They have a different set of problems from carriers when it's time to run out of IPv4 space and to make the transition. So for the folks here who work for, say, a broadband provider, the question is, what if you weren't getting $39.95 a month from your customers? What if you had 1/1000th as many customers, but they paid you 1,000 times as much? The average managed hosting revenue per customer is $60,000 a year, and it goes straight up from there. The tolerance for disruption for these folks, because of the amount of money they're paying, is much lower. In most cases, you're hosting their servers. They have a lot of end-user endpoints at their enterprise or at broadband home users, hitting a relatively small number of endpoints. So that tolerance for disruption is going to be extremely low. It's not like someone can't get reachability to their favorite website. It's a 500-person company can't get reachability to their accounting system, or 10% of the folks can't get access to their email. These things are really major disruptions. There's also a lack of enterprise understanding or urgency in regard to IPv6. Part of this is that there's a perception on the enterprise. They say to their hosting provider, they say to their carrier, this is your problem. Part of it is also there's a situation of the boy who cried wolf. One problem we've had in this community is that for 10 years, people were running around saying we're running out of IPv4 space, and some of them made dire predictions that turned out not to be true. And when a lot of enterprise decision makers here, or in 2004, that we're running out of IPv4 space in 6 months, and it doesn't happen, skepticism starts to set in. So the perspective, and I surveyed about a half dozen from relatively small, 10 million-ish revenue, to very large hosting providers, and I got a lot of good sound bites and a lot of information. One of the better quotes I got was, the customer experience is not about the packet being shipped to them. It's about end-to-end experience, from typing in the URL to application delivery. And that means these guys are held accountable for that whole value chain, and not just for, we've got internet service, your green light's on. Servers, and for these folks, servers and networking are the easy part. Most new servers are being deployed dual stack at hosting providers. I'd say 90% of new servers are being deployed dual stack, unless a customer has an absolute, bar on that. Almost every hosting provider network is IPv6 enabled, with very, very few exceptions. They almost all have DNS. Their IPv6 is enabled on DNS with IPv6 records for newer servers, although not necessarily the older stuff. Everything else is hard. So the servers and the network were the easy part. And you might say, what else is there other than servers and network? Sadly, there is a lot other than servers and network. First, OSS and billing systems are still primarily IPv4. And it would be great if we lived in a world where these OSS and billing systems were totally agnostic to the IP address. Unfortunately, they all have hard-coded IPv4 address-based spots in their databases, and this is what people bill on. So this is a problem, and this is something that has to get fixed, and it's non-trivial. A lot of the support equipment, quote-unquote, is a massive concern. Things like firewalls, intrusion detection and prevention systems, global server load balancers. These are the pieces of equipment that you might say, well, the vendors support this stuff. Well, some of them support in software, some of them support in hardware. There's a marked lack of confidence in these devices in particular, as they support tens of thousands of servers in hosted environments. And the thing I heard repeatedly from hosting providers large and small was the need for real IPv4 to IPv6 NAT in a shipped, proven, scalable hardware solution. Hosting, for vendors in the audience, hosting providers are not feeling the love here. Can you turn Dave on?
You there? All right. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
In your thing there, you say there is no carrier grade NAT. Is that because it does? Are people saying it doesn't exist, or they don't need it, or both?
No, people are saying that there's no shipping solution that gives them what they need today to install in their network.
And is it really NAT that people need? People like NAT because they think it's a security appliance sometimes. But it looks like what that your picture looks like it means protocol translation, right?
That's what they're saying is NAT. What they mean is protocol translation. The kind of folks I'm talking to are not guys who are putting NAT for security. I mean, these are folks who have 100,000 servers. They do get it.
Right. So it's translation.
It is translation, but I think a good point for the folks who work for vendors here is they're not probably going to say translation. They're probably going to say NAT because that's what they say. So if somebody says that, I think it behooves you to do what Dave just did and drill down a little bit, because what they really do want is the magic protocol translation box, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a monolithic device. For the hosting providers, it doesn't need to be one box that sits at the very edge of the network. A lot of them have told me they'd be very happy to have more smaller boxes that they can put in front of individual customers to enable separate compliance and billing requirements.
One more thing on this, and then I'll stop beating the dead horse here. The reason that we need this is because the perception is there that the world is really IPv4 still.
No, not really. I mean, there's really a couple reasons this is needed. One reason is because at some point in the future, these folks won't be able to get IPv4 addresses sometime very soon. At that point, what they're going to be able to do is they're going to be able to put on an RFC 1918 address, and they'll be able to put on a IPv6 address. And they're going to need, folks to be able to get access to these servers who are sitting on IPv4 endpoints or who have sort of fractured IPv6 connectivity and need to write over IPv4 networks. These folks also desperately need the ability for someone who is, for example, on an IPv6 endpoint to reach legacy IPv4 content, because these guys have a lot of servers, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 servers that were installed before IPv6 became a real reality. And it's going to take, in some cases, 3 or 4 years for these servers to slowly be moved out of service. And it's unlikely that folks are going to go and put IPv6 on these because the risk of disruption is just too great. Sir.
Jason Scheller, Verizon Business Unit. I'm a little confused about what you're saying, because it sounds to me the solution you described is deploy dual stack IPv6, and when you run out of v4 addresses, start deploying NAT44. So I'm not sure I understand where you get the conclusion of we need a protocol translator.
It's not my, with all due respect, it's not my conclusion. This is the conclusion from, relatively large hosting company engineering staffs, that they feel that this is a necessary instrument, and they don't, either they're not educated, although some are in this room, or they disagree with you. So, and in fact, you may want to talk to the Verizon Business Hosting guys, because they may not agree with you. So, oh, I'm sorry. I'm looking the other way.
Or it's a transition mechanism that many of these guys, since they're not prepared for v6 on their server infrastructure, are trying to patch things together. I think they'll need to patch things together to do as exactly what you said, which is let those v4 machines slowly cycle out of their maintenance cycle, instead of necessarily trying to dual stack the machines themselves.
Yeah, and
that's what I'm saying.
That is a real issue, because I think people are afraid that if they dual stack a 3-year-old machine that's been running an application just fine, chances are nothing bad will happen. But if something bad happens in 2 or 5% of the cases, that's a lot of money for these guys, and they're just not willing to take the risk.
What I am surprised about is that you're seeing a significant number of them believe that there are not devices out there ready to do that for them, because I've not tested any of them yet, but there are several vendors that claim that they do. So maybe they haven't gotten the
Please
sales
state
pitch.
your name and affiliation when you come to the microphone.
Brandon Ross, and I'll wear my Tory Point group hat.
Yeah. So I think the main concern isn't that there are vendors out there claiming that they can do this. I think the concerns are that the devices aren't proven, and their scalability isn't proven, and their ability to provide uptime and their software stability over a long period of time isn't proven.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah. Avi Friedman.
Avi Friedman, would you like to fill in my affiliation?
I forget what it is. Oh, Server Central. I'm sorry.
Central, yes.
Pat.
I don't know about what's available, but I can tell you that from a hosting perspective, some of the driver for this is many applications, which for a lot of the customers just means more than one, which is enough. Break horribly if you enable dual stack on the machine, because the stuff that works fine with v4 was never tested with v6 enabled, and it tries to attach and it tries to do things and it doesn't work, and that's a real problem. So for a lot of customers with an existing solution, you want something that just makes it magically so without having to get into the OS.
Thank you, Chief Technology Officer of a major hosting company. So you heard it from the horse's mouth, as it were. Oh, over here. Dave Temkin. I was about to say Netflix. I'm sorry.
Bridgewater Associates.
Yes.
Absolutely nothing to do with hosting. Do you think that there's going to be a market that emerges, or has it already emerged, or in your discussions with these guys, where they're going to start selling v4 as a value-added service, and basically you spin up a VM and you get v6 by default, and you're paying them some exorbitant fee to get v4?
I don't believe so. I had some surprising interactions with these folks regarding some economic issues. The most surprising was I asked them, do you plan on buying v4 addresses? They almost all said no, which was a bit shocking. The second was, do you plan on offering, differentiated levels of service for v4 versus v6? That had not occurred to most of them.
That's kind of surprising to me, because I would almost figure that, providers for years have charged more, the SOHO/small business providers have charged more for years for, say, a static IP. So I can certainly see these guys gravitating towards
But I think the thing to keep in mind is when you're already charging someone $1,000 for a managed server every month or more, and you say now it's going to be $1,500 if you want an IPv4 address, a competitor will take advantage of that and smash you. Because even though it is a very dynamic, thriving marketplace, the competition is very serious.
Sure. Thanks.
Yeah, and to some degree also, I mean, I think this is the difference between someone paying $9.95 for a web hosting account and $1,000 a month for a managed server is the customers won't put up with being nickeled and dimed for this stuff. Okay, so what are the top concerns? The top concerns, this is not a slap at carriers, but the one thing I heard repeatedly was that carriers are not seen as being particularly useful in the context of the IPv6 transition. You know, one person told me that they did not believe the carriers would be taking care of anything, and if anyone in the industry believed that, they deserve to fail. They're doomed. Now, that was a particularly harsh and amusing statement. I think he's in this room. The patchwork, the other big concern I heard was that the patchwork of IPv6 at carrier networks was a real concern. So in other words, end-to-end delivery, not through tunnels, you know, with the same level of optimal traffic delivery that is found in IPv4 carrier networks, not just on one network, but from network to network to network, from end to end. That was also a concern. And the concern wasn't that the packet wouldn't be delivered. The concern was that the path of the delivery would be less optimal than we see today in IPv4 networks, which work really, really well. And you may say, but it's the same network. I think there's concerns that if there's one network on the path that isn't doing things properly, or there's a situation at a peering point, this is just a concern that these folks have, because this isn't something that's in their control. There are also scaling concerns with IPv6 around software and hardware. For the most part, these folks are saying, yes, everything I have supports v6. That checkbox is there. But the primary concern is that it supports it at this traffic level, at this load level. Is it going to scale well? I mean, I don't know if VJ's here, but scaling is a concern with these folks. And there was also the concern that as this stuff gets deployed widely and rapidly, there's going to be a very fast series of patches and of software upgrades that are going to roll out at a pace that we haven't seen in quite a while. You know, for a long time, I think the software that we've used has been relatively stable, and there's concern that we'll be going back into a period of instability in the software that we're running on our devices in order to fix corner cases, reachability issues, and because we will be touching these devices and because we will be putting new software in these devices, that will also be a vector of instability. And the phrase used was stacking up multiple points of failure. Troubleshooting is a big concern for these folks, and the reason troubleshooting is a concern, and this was the most often mentioned concern, DNS was mentioned repeatedly as a source of worry. And the thing that came up again and again was how will technical staff differentiate between an IPv4 problem and an IPv6 problem? There was a concern that the troubleshooting tools aren't in place to do that. And how do you know if this is an application issue? How do you know if this is an issue with IPv6, IPv4, the interaction between the two with DNS? This is a concern. In addition, I think there was some concern about, the day after, addressing servers with IPv6 only possibly. This is ameliorated to a certain point because many hosting providers already have RFC 1918 addresses on all of their servers and are doing some kind of address translation already, so this becomes somewhat less of a concern. But there was certainly the concern that customers are going to hold the hosting providers responsible rather than access networks for individual reachability problems. And so there are communication concerns about, do I have the right ways to reach out to carriers and interact with them? And of course, legacy servers are concerned. There are and will be for 2 to 5 years large numbers, and these are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of legacy servers that are and will be IPv4 only at these hosting providers. And that's going to cause some issues going forward. In conclusion, I think we've had some reasonable preparation from the hosting community. I think there were false starts from what we think of as the internet community that were perhaps not helpful to these folks, from the RIRs and the IETF in particular. That certainly the boy who cried wolf didn't help people get the budget and the resources they need to do a successful transition. The hosting sector is growing very rapidly, probably 20% year over year in terms of revenue. That's not helping the situation. That's actually hurting things. Because at the same time you're trying to scale your organization, you're trying to make this major change, and that's pretty tough. I don't think we're yet ready. I think that the hardware vendors and scaling concerns are the top solvable issues. And I think that the major takeaway from my research in this area is that most of these folks are prepared for a major period of instability. And by instability, I don't mean, does the internet work today? I mean, right now, the internet is extremely stable in comparison to, say, 1998 or 1999. I think there's a concern that for a couple of years, we're going to be turning back the clock a little bit in terms of reachability, tough to troubleshoot problems, and there'll be generally be lower customer satisfaction for the next several years as this transition occurs. And that's all I've got. Any questions, comments, concerns?
Dave Meyer. I want to say like Dave Meyer IAJ, would that work? Or no?
Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah. Oh, no, sorry. Okay, I had a couple questions for you. The first one is, you talked about potential instability, and this is mostly because, code just doesn't work that well, and you have to run it a long time before it starts working better.
Yeah.
But especially in the hosting, or at least in the large-scale data center world, a lot of the network world is getting sucked back up into the hosts, into the servers. So, for example, you have a bunch of VMs, and you have actually a virtual switch and the hypervisor and all this stuff.
Right.
What about that aspect of the IPv6 thing? Is that as unstable as people are perceiving?
I don't think that's as unstable. And the key issue with almost all of this stuff is age. It's how old the stuff is and how close when the stuff was sort of instantiated to today. So most of the cloud stuff and most of the virtual stuff and the hosted private cloud, there's a variety of services. Most of these are actually of relatively recent vintage. And so my personal opinion, and I have no science behind this, is that stuff will probably work a little bit better. Whereas, Joe's had a server sitting in a colo for 5 years is probably in much bigger trouble. But I have no science for that because I don't think we'll know until we see more implementation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, one other thing. So a lot of people have asked me this week, I managed to stay out of the press, I'm really proud of that. A lot of people asked me this week, well, what is IPv4 runout? What is runout? And I thought about this a lot, and, the analogy I came up with, and I floated it with some of my colleagues, is something like, okay, suppose you could demonstrably show that you mined the last gold out of the earth. Are you out of gold at that point?
Of course not.
Yes, that's the answer, right? So all of our activity, or much of our activity, seems to be around the fact that the self-governance mechanism we have in place, RIRs and all of this stuff, can't function without this free pool available. And down the chain of that means that IP addresses are not going to be available at the same kind of cost profile as they are now, perhaps. So the question really became, for a lot of people asked me, well, we're all focused on it's really focusing on the self-governance aspect of the runout's about running out of being able to self-govern the IP address space, right? If a market were to emerge. So a lot of people have asked me, there's a lot of focus on the runout and very little focus on, at least in these kind of discussions, on what the alternative future universes could look like. Can you say anything about that for this group?
I think there is. I'll comment on, and then I'll turn it over to John. This is something we've argued about for many years. I don't think there's any question, if you look at a broad swath of economic research, that the method that we utilized as a community to distribute IPv4 addresses, which we did not realize were a finite resource, but really were a finite resource, that the method we used for distributing a finite resource was perhaps one of the most suboptimal methods for finite resource distribution that exists in our current understanding of how economics works. That being said, at the time we didn't realize it was finite, and at the time, I think there were still questions about what the most optimum methods of resource distribution were. At this point, we know better. That being said, how much of a market will there be for IPv4 addresses? I think as long as there are reasonable mediation mechanisms, in other words, a marketplace for people to come together, brokers that develop to sell IPv4, I think there will, over time, be a thriving market in IPv4. I think it's inevitable because I think there'll be things that you have to use it for. The beauty is that our method of IPv4 distribution was so inefficient that I believe there actually is lots and lots of unused IPv4 out there. I think there's lots of research showing this is true on the routing table, and I think that will keep IPv4 prices low in the market. And John?
My turn to comment? Okay. Test. Okay. So I don't know whether or not you said it's a crisis in self-governance. If that's what you're saying, I really don't believe that. So the community actually has adopted policies that say you can transfer address space, but the only parties that can receive it are ones that still have documented need. RFC 2050 actually says transfers have to occur, but transfers can occur between parties to someone who still has need. Now that does preclude speculators, it does preclude brokers to some extent, since the transfer has to go to someone who's actually going to make use of it. But the reality is that we have a mechanism in place now that's actually a market mechanism, because it is quite possible for parties that have address space they don't need. A lot of these folks turned in their address space. Stanford University, Department of Defense, BBN, Interop, all turned in address space because they got it for free and they didn't need it and they realized it was for the community. But for the folks who didn't, or the folks who need to do a lot of work to free up the address space, they have a way of actually getting compensated for that, and it will result in that address space coming back into the community and being used for someone who has need. So we actually have many aspects of a market system post-runout in place today. We'd like to make sure that that works among all the regions, because that should be, that's obvious that all regions should benefit equally. But the fact of the matter is that when you say what alternative mechanisms, I don't know what you'd be proposing, but the public policy mailing list is open, and you should drop an email if you want a different proposal. Yeah, keep his turned off.
I have to say, I do think there's a role here for brokers. I don't think, and I think it's going to be important. If the expectation from Aaron is that people will randomly find each other, who need address space, I think that's unlikely. I think brokers don't have to buy a resource to sell it. I think there's there's a need in the community for folks to say, I know of people who have this inventory.
There's a listing service that's available for that purpose.
Yeah, and I think more than a listing service, I think we're going to need, motivated middlemen who can take 10% of the deal. I think it's a very reasonable thing to do. I think that role is none of Aaron's business, no offense, whether brokers have an appropriate role. One of the interesting aspects of this, and John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I sell Patrick IP address space, yeah, like that'll happen. Aaron is not a third-party signatory to the contract. The contract, you have a regulatory oversight role, but you're not a signatory to the contract with Patrick and I, right? Or am I wrong?
The transfer is something that goes, you may have a contract between you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a party to that contract. But
Okay.
that's also not the contract that makes the transfer happen.
Mm-hmm.
The transfer happens because of the agreement with Aaron.
Well, you guys, it's no different from selling a house, though, right?
No, it's a huge difference.
Okay, well,
He actually puts in a transfer request to receive, or whoever's receiving, to receive those addresses.
right.
Okay? And that does or doesn't go through, and then you can pay him or not, but you actually never do a bill of sale.
But, well, I certainly understand that, but essentially you guys are acting as a title authority and as sort of a zoning regulator, rather than,
If you have an agreement with him, you have an agreement with him, but you don't
Right.
have to do a transfer.
Okay, I think that's fair enough.
We don't even look at what you guys have between each other. We don't want to know what you have between them. All we know is communities have policies. Those policies say when we can do a transfer, okay? We change records when what you show up with matches the community policy.
So you will guarantee that as the CEO of Aaron, that one of your analysts will not ask to see the contract between two private parties for the transfer space?
We follow the policies in the NRPM, and if that currently says you have to say yes and he has to say yes, that's what we do. It doesn't talk about documentation of a sale.
Okay.
Did you want to?
Or transfer, we should say.
Elise wants to say something.
Anyway, it's a fascinating conversation, and we're supposedly operators here. And this is, how do we manage a finite resource? But I think the other points that came up in the conversation from Dan is not so much about this marketplace, and I'm sure you at the microphone want to talk about that. But I just wanted to bring us back to the fact that it is a finite resource. The world has a population of 7 billion people. There's only about 3.5 billion IPv4 addresses. That means if everybody wanted an IPv4 address for their cell phone, not everybody in the world could have one. So we could sell and trade and do whatever we wanted with IPv4, but we do have to look at the other parts of the presentations that talked about vendor support, infrastructure support. What do we do for what looks like an infinite resource today, which is the IPv6 pool? And I just wanted to bring us back to that, even though I think this is a fascinating discussion, but keep in your mind that as operators, you really have to look at the infrastructure and what you're going to need to have the servers supported and the hosting sites supported, because that is the infinite resource, and you can buy and sell in the interim.
Are we sure IPv6 is infinite? Because there was a time we swore. No, I'm serious. I know people are going to think I'm crazy. There was a time we swore IPv4 was infinite.
But I did say it looks infinite. I didn't say it. Obviously, it's not. It's a finite
It's certainly
number.
Closer to infinite, but not. Who was
And
next?
I expect to be retired before all IPv6 goes out.
Yeah, I know. There's a lot of people that feel that way. Avi?
I have such great respect for both of the gentlemen who are engaged in the discussion that
But we're both wrong.
I can't actually say that either of you are wrong, so I'll say that both of you are somewhat correct. And I think clearly, given the framework of the community, I think the community is continuing to have an active role in setting what they want to have happen. And it's unlikely that you're going to have brokers that take possession and ownership of address space because they can't actually get it transferred to them unless they make stuff up and write programs to generate fake network maps and all that. On the other hand, I think that for things to operate efficiently, there needs to be something that is perhaps even more than just a listing service, and perhaps actually something that facilitates the buyers and sellers in figuring out what the supply is and what price people are willing to bid and ask at. And it's difficult to actually see how you could avoid letting someone speculate on that kind of infrastructure, even if they couldn't take possession, but we'll sort of leave that aside. So my question is, what is this listing service to which you refer? And is anyone aware of anything slightly more whether it's market-like or eBay-like or Sato-like or whatever that is evolving? Because I think something like that, where there are people who know who the suppliers and buyers are and assist but don't get in the middle of the transactions.
So, specified transfer listing service is documented on the Aaron website. It's basically a list of those parties who say they have address space that they could make available. Okay, they may not have it available now, but they might have to do some work to make it. But space they could make available. We'll validate that they're the holder of record because that's kind of convenient. And then on the other side, parties who say, I have a need. It's been approved by Aaron, but Aaron doesn't have the resources. So I have an approved need. I am capable of being the other half of a transfer. And all we're doing is making those lists available. Nothing says money. Nothing says how much. It's just contact information for parties to find each other, exactly to facilitate a broker, an eBay, someone else. So we implement the information that's needed so the community can find each other and make that happen. But we're not going to set that up. That's most certainly not our role.
If you'll excuse me, I'm going to go start writing some code. I'll see.
Okay, great. Chris
Morrow. So the transfer thing doesn't have to be an actual transfer, though, right? I mean, I can say to my friend Jason, I would like to spend $10,000 for a T1 with a /24 assigned to it, right?
Right. So, I mean, if your question is, under the transfer policy, under specified transfer, as long as you qualify to receive address space, you either get it from Aaron, or if you can't, you can get it from any party who can make it available.
Right. I mean, like I said, if I have a friend who I know has lots of address space, maybe not Jason, I can say, I'd like to buy a T1 to you, or I'd like to buy a 10 meg Ethernet cross-connected in Equinix, right?
As long as, well, I mean, you can buy telecommunication services. I guess when you're saying transfer address space, you would have to qualify under the NRPM to receive the space.
What I'm saying is that transfer doesn't have to actually happen, right? Transfer is the official, I have an address block, I don't want it anymore, I'm going to give it to Bill.
Right. A
I'm
transfer
saying
that
if I
actually
need address
changes.
space, I can just say, I'd like to buy a link I'm never going to use, and I'll spend an absurd amount of money for it.
Right. So let's talk about that. So a transfer is when we actually update the holder of record in the registry. Very simple stuff.
Yes.
But it's possible for you to make use of address space and never transfer it. Okay? Now, right now, that's something that Aaron we don't spend any attention to. It's not our job. It is possible for the community to pass policies that makes that our job to go look and decide if that's fraudulent. We would need crystal clear guidance before we walked over into that part of the realm.
Right. And one last thing. To Elisa's point about, we should also talk about V6. I think one important thing is there's lots of infrastructure, and some of it we talked about is servers and PCs and things. There's lots of embedded infrastructure that will never see V6, and it will be in existence for the next 20 plus years. Right. So, and those things over time, they will need to be addressed. Right. They currently have addresses on them. Okay. I'm thinking of power systems.
So John, what do you think of a collateralized IP address obligation where I borrowed a bunch of /24s from a bunch of people in this room and then in turn lent it to another end user? And it never, and I never then actually, transferred it.
If you attempt a transfer that doesn't match the policies, we will note it as resource fraud and return them and reclaim them, give them to someone who does. If you don't attempt to change the registry of record, that's up to you. It's only when someone tries to change what's in who is to the holder of record that we make sure that they pass the policies. Service providers provide addresses as part of service right now.
Leslie Daigle, Internet Society. The deck chairs are lovely, are they not? Maybe we should create a repository to, list all the possible configurations and rearrangements we can make of them. A little less flippantly, I think that what Elise is getting at, and I certainly support it even while respecting what Chris has said in terms of there will be IPv4, a need for IPv4 for a goodly long time going. You drive where you're looking, and right now we're looking at IPv4 as if, creating listing services and a lot of infrastructure, et cetera, will somehow make it the solution for the long term, and it's not. We really do need to look at just exactly how much infrastructure is needed in terms of handling transfers reasonably and effectively so that we can move on to IPv6. But the more energy we put into building, the best buttressed IPv4 transfer mechanisms for all the edge cases we can possibly contemplate, the less energy we're putting in realizing that the ship is sinking and we need to get to the lifeboats.
I disagree very strongly. And the reason why is because if Aaron is going to maintain its stewardship, then it desperately needs to ensure that all of the stakeholders involved have access to the resources they need during the transition. And if they fail to do so, and there have been times in the past when the Aaron membership, sort of the people who show up to meetings, have been very blind to this and have taken that line, we'll just switch. Who cares about V4? We need to ditch this now. But there are strong commercial concerns.
So I understand that, and I agree with that, because I'm fully supportive of having a robust and reliable allocation and management system for all the good reasons. However, my point is to not fixate on that to the point where we overlook the need to just move on, because polishing this one to perfection is not doing the community any services whatsoever, any good services. But again, I don't disagree, it needs to work and work properly.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this up. John, it
Well, I
has a comment.
just want to say, I don't think we're polishing it to perfection, but the community asked for this capability, so we gave it to them. The reality is that anybody who makes use of this as a short-term solution, the transfer policy or the listing service, is probably, serving their immediate need. I'm not sure anyone is brave enough to rely on that as a strategic, long-term alternative to V6. And if they do, I don't think they'd want to tell their investors that.
Okay. I guess he left the microphone, so
Miriam.
Miriam.
Hi, I'm Miriam Kühne from the RIPE NCC, one of the other 5 RIRs, and I'm actually only the messenger here. I have a question here for Dan from Daniel Karenberg, also from the RIPE NCC. And he's asking, you mentioned a lot of economic research showing that the IPv4 address space distribution has been done in the most inefficient ways possible, I think was your wording. And he's asking if you could specify that a bit more, what kind of research there was and what you've actually used exactly, to...
Actually, that wasn't my wording, but what I said was that there's been a tremendous amount of economic research around distribution of finite resources in the most efficient way possible.
Okay.
I'm happy to send links, but this has been the subject of reams of economic research. And it's pretty well established that for a finite resource, the most efficient method of distributing it is a market-based method rather than a sort of command-based method or central planning method. There are folks who disagree, and I certainly acknowledge that those folks exist. But at this point in history, the weight of the research is certainly towards market rather than central planning based.
Okay, well, let's hope there was a successful, satisfying answer for Daniel, and otherwise I'm sure he'll follow up with you.
Great. And, okay, well, we're going to wrap this up. So I don't know if is it break now or? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everybody.